Branding isn't just about flashy logos. It's not about your catchy slogans. It's about consistent communication. It's about clearly, effectively telling the world who you are, what you stand for, and why you matter as a church.
Hey everyone, welcome back to season 2 of the Church Circle podcast, and it's been such a great season so far, so many great guests, and as you guys know, we've been kind of expanding our horizons on what we talk about on this podcast. It was just more about church creatives in the first season, and this season we're really diving into all things church, whether that's pastoral, vision and giving, outreach, and this week we're talking about branding because it's a very important conversation for every church, no matter the size or the style. And who else better to join us today than Stephen? And Stephen, maybe just share a little bit about yourself and who you are, maybe a bit about your story, just so you can set the scene as to why you are the branding guru.
Sure. Well, I don't think I'm the branding guru, but I'll take the title, I guess, for today. My name is Stephen Houk, and I grew up in Southern California. And my first exposure to design work was probably my 9th and 10th grade year in high school. I was on the yearbook staff team. My sister was actually the yearbook teacher, God help her. But that was a very rough patch for her. We had a lot of rowdy kids and stuff. But my interest in design really peaked when I got a hold of Photoshop. And I think that's probably everybody's starting point. But it was Photoshop 7. It was an iMac 2nd gen. With the really cool moving screen. Mm-hmm. And I fell in love with Adobe products and Apple products like that same year. I just fell in love with it and learned Photoshop the hard way by putting people's faces on my teachers' bodies and vice versa. Like that was just, we were just fooling around in Photoshop. And one of the things that we had learned though is InDesign. And a lot of schools don't usually, do that in yearbook class anymore. But we did InDesign, and that's really where I started learning the principles of design, was those 3 years of high school in the yearbook class. From there, my wife and I, we met at Bible college and decided to go in full-time ministry. And we were at a church up in Northern California for about 8.5 years, just under 9 years. And there I worked mainly in the college department or ministry where we had Bible studies and different things, but then a large part of that process was also being overseeing our media department, and really our church at that point had a logo a little bit, and then they had some type of a web presence, and social media really wasn't existent with them. So during that time, just really every year kind of took it to the next level with their print, digital, all of that. So it was heavy workload for sure. But during that time, being in the Bay Area, it was very expensive. And so over time, just kind of word of mouth, people started reaching out to me, asking me to design something for their church. And it's like, oh, we'll pay you. And so over the years, it kind of just grew and grew and grew. And so right at the 8.5 year mark, my wife and I were just like, man, we need, we were very unsettled if that was where God wanted us. And over a long time of prayer, we decided to go full time into the church media space. And before I even heard of Church Media Squad, but basically January 1st, that week, we moved from California, sunny California, to -4 degrees in Ohio. So that's a long story in of itself. I'll spare everybody with that. But basically from January of 2018, really all the way up until I joined the squad in 2021, worked with dozens and dozens of churches, missionaries, and loved every bit of it. It just got to the point where it was a lot of work. It seemed like 7 days a week. There was a lot of boundaries that I didn't set, to where I had staff members of churches texting me like on a Saturday night or Sunday morning. I'm like, shouldn't you be on the platform right now? Like, why are you texting me about something? So it was there was a lot of things that I was working 12, 14-hour days, and it was just unhealthy. And so 2021, my wife had already been working at the squad, and she just kept telling me, she's like, you should apply. And I was like, I don't think that's the right fit. So finally I did apply, got an interview the same day. And over the next 48 hours or so, worked with Michael and Bennett on transferring a plan to transfer all of my clients over to the Church Media Squad, where the majority of them are still there today. So that's encouraging. But it was a good transition. It was a healthy transition. And then in 2022, the summer of 2022, Michael approached me and some other people on the squad saying, "Hey, we would like to rebrand the company. We want to, work on the colors. We want to work on a new logo, all of that stuff." And so we were like, "Sure, let's jump on it." And we only had a couple of months to really crank something out before our squad retreat in August, I believe it was. That whole process really started inside of me as saying, man, I really would love to have a product or a service that the squad can offer to churches. I had already previously done it prior to the squad. It was a very successful process, working with churches and understanding them, and not just building out a logo, but understanding their culture and their communications. And so I pitched that product to Michael and Bennett. They were like, "Oh yeah, we could start offering logos and stuff like that." And I'm sure that they're probably laughing as they're listening to this now, because I told them, I said, "Man, this is more than just logos. This is diving deep down into like the strategy, the foundation of the brand of the church." And lo and behold, right after our beta, early 2023, we started picking up steam. We've done a lot of, probably, I think it's almost 24 churches over the last 16 months. And currently we're working on several large churches going through the process and coming out of that process encouraged and realizing like, wow, we discovered things of ourselves that we didn't really know, existed. And so there's, it's been a good process, and we're establishing a great team. Spencer on the brand squad, he's incredibly talented. He picks up a lot of the weaknesses that I have as a designer or something like that. And so together we've been working really well together, and we're looking for some additional team members to join the strategy division at the squad. And so overall, it's been a ride. Like, it's been incredible. I've enjoyed every church that we've gotten to work with, pre-squad days and during the squad days here. And so, that's a little bit of my story in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that springs to mind is experience. Like, you've pretty much seen every angle of the church. Like, you've worked in a church, you've worked with churches in a freelance capacity, and then you've worked with churches in an agency capacity. And so you've seen every facet and every style of church, every size of church. And obviously this conversation's about branding. And out of that experience, you've kind of more shifted into the branding world. Now, what I'm curious about is kind of for churches that don't know, I mean, for anyone listening, it doesn't really know anything about branding. We hear that word a lot, right? Like someone says, "Oh, I've got a new brand." But what does that actually mean, especially for churches? Like, is it just a logo, like Bennett and Michael were saying, or is it is it something bigger than that? You're saying about diving deep, or what does that actually mean for a church?
If you think about it, we interact with brands every day without even realizing it. And sometimes when we think of a specific company or product or service, we already have an idea, even if we've never participated in it or used that product or gone to that store. We already have probably an idea in our mind of what that is. For instance, there's been a lot of companies in the news lately. Obviously, Budweiser and Bud Light and Target and all these places that are starting to get a very negative idea of their brand, whereas they used to have a really good, positive, thing with their customers, but now it's turning to the negative. Churches that think that branding is not relevant to them are missing the mark. One of my favorite authors is Marty Neumeier. He's written several books. One is The Brand Gap. And he says this about branding. He says, a brand is not what you say it is. It's what they say it is. So regardless of what you think your church is communicating, it really comes down to what your community is hearing and what your community thinks. And so your brand is really your testimony. It's your reputation, if you want to use those Christian words, right? It's how you're coming across your community. You can come across with massive amounts of truth or massive amounts of grace. But what about the balance of those two things? And so a lot of it is just understanding what the church is, how it started, how it's progressing, how it's growing. Maybe there's ups and downs. Recently, we've talked to a lot of churches and asked them about how they've survived COVID and how it's been a hurt or a help to them. A lot of churches have come back saying, "Man, it helped us. It helped
Hmm.
us realize and really dig down deep of like what we did wrong prior to those days when everybody was coming to church, and now we're dealing with trying to get people to get out of their houses and get back to normal and even it's 2024, right? And people are still kind of struggling to get back to a community. And so I think the brand identity of a church is vitally important. Not just the brand identity. When we talk about brand identity, that's part of your brand. Your
Yeah.
brand is, your actual name, your product, your service, your church. Your brand identity is really kind of narrowing it down even more. It's that outward expression of your
Hmm.
brand. So it could obviously be your logo, your tone, your visual elements, all of those things. I'm not a crazy fan of Jeff Bezos, but he said this. He said your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of times people will make decisions in the staff meeting or in the boardroom, and they're not even consulting people outside that are participating in their services or their product or their service. And so I think churches need to kind of take a step back and realize, okay, let's not make so many decisions that are top heavy from the staff meeting or from the leadership chair, and not consult about like, hey, actual people in the community, what do you guys think about our church? And get the raw answers of what people actually think, because it's not like you're going to change your doctrine, but you'd be surprised about changing the way you say those things, the tone
Hmm.
of voice. All of those things are vitally important to your brand. A lot of times people just think it's a logo or a color palette. And I've worked with churches that have changed it probably every 2 or 3 years on the dot, right? They
Yeah.
change their colors or they change, and I don't think that's a right way to look at branding. You can't just change a logo and expect everybody to kind of like, oh wow, it's a different church. No, you gotta dig down deep and understand that there's a strategy behind it, and with a lot of prayer and spirits leading, of course, through that whole process.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is like there's quite often when we look at branding, people just go, "Oh, it's a new logo." Like they've introduced a new logo, maybe some new colors, but there's a flip side to that. It's like, firstly, that's not just branding because there's so much more to it, but also that in terms of escape, like let's say a church has a bad reputation, right? Sometimes they think they can escape that reputation by just changing the look of it, but unfortunately, like even if you change the name, that you are going to be followed by that reputation, and that's the biggest thing.
Right.
We're looking at an overall picture, and like it's not just the logo, it's not just the visual identity, and that does play an important role. But I think the visual identity really is a trigger point to trigger people into thinking in a good way, into thinking, okay,
Right.
what is it about this church that I know? What is it about this church that like the reputation? It's kind of like I see the visual identifier, I know that's the church. Now the brand reputation comes through that. So for a church that's like thinking about, okay, well, I hear what you're saying, Stephen. I understand that branding is important. I've now got an idea of why it's important. What are like some first steps into recognizing that and starting to build a strategy for updating their brand, or even just understanding what the next steps are?
Yeah, so I believe there's three key important steps that you can take. The first one is clarifying your mission. The second thing is understanding your audience. And the third thing is setting actual goals. And I feel like there's a lot of churches that we'll meet with, and we'll explain to them, hey, we have 3 steps in our process. There's discovery, then we work on the strategy. The last part, that's when we actually touch on your logo, your colors, and all of that. And they kind of take a step back and are surprised. But I tell them like, hey, we're digging down deep into your foundation to see what's cracking, what's working, what's not, what's unstable. It's not that we're experts at ministry and that we're kind of coming in and trying to tell you what to do. We're coming in with fresh eyes and a fresh perspective to help you understand like, hey, maybe this is the weak pillar. Maybe this is the weak spot. And people don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. I think that's vitally important for churches to understand is like they don't just come to church because you have a kids program or this or that. They really want to buy into why you're actually doing things. Why should they come to your church and not the church down the road?
Hmm.
And a lot of times, we're not trying to compare ourselves to other churches, but if you've been called to have a church and have a place in the community, you need to know why you're doing it. it shouldn't just be, oh, my parents wanted it, or my senior pastor from the other church I worked at no, you need to clarify the vision and mission for your church, for
Yeah.
why God called you to do that. And so we'll dive into a lot of the history of all of that, and then understanding your audience. During the strategy portion of our process, we always tell people, like, we do these stylescapes, and they are starting to have a visual identity of what their brand could look like. And we encourage people, hey, print those out, put them on an iPad, do something, and take them to the nearest coffee shop, a place that normal people just hang out, and just say, hey, we're from such and such church, and we're here, we're rebranding, and we're trying to really understand how to resonate and how to help people in the community. What do you guys think about this visual direction? And we've had several people do that, come back and be like, man, we were blown away with what we thought was good. They went the opposite direction, or they had some really good thoughts on the stuff that we did like. And so it's really been kind of an unveiling and kind of a revelation for them to understand, like, hey, it's not all about what we think is good and a good direction. It's what people that we're reaching, what they're coming to. The brand itself is a set of expectations. It's a set of memories, stories, relationships, and it's really, that's what's involved in the decision making of people. When you go out and buy a product or participate in an event, like, you are buying into that. And so when people are coming to your church, they're giving you the chance to convince them that this is a place where their life can be changed.
Yeah.
And if your voice and your visual, assets are not appealing to them, they're going to walk. And I've personally, as a designer, as a creative, I guess it's maybe a curse, but there's been some churches that are great churches, but I'll walk into the lobby or into the service, and I'll be handed a 8-page bulletin, or I'll be handed, like, the screens are very, not appealing at all. They're very distracting. And I know that sounds shallow maybe, but from my perspective, I'm just like, well, if you couldn't take the time to put good effort and good design behind things that are visual and printed, why should I give you guys a shot? Like, that's my perspective. And I feel like that's a lot of people's perspective. Why would I go to a store when it's dirty? Like,
Sure.
Yeah, they may have great prices, but why would I go when the staff is rude? Why would I go to that restaurant? Churches need to take a step back and realize, hey, people aren't just going to come to your church because of it. It's a church. They're going to come because they want to have something done in their life that nobody else can do. And I think churches need to get back to that.
For sure. And that's the thing, is that it's really about, like you said, like, buying into vision. And I think especially in this generation, as we move like further into Gen Z, Gen A, a lot of people are no longer doing things out of habit. They're doing things out of what they want to do, out of lifestyle choices. I think COVID was the turn for this, where people said, actually, I don't have to go to church today. I can watch it on my couch, or I don't have to go to church today. This is a habit that I've been doing for 20 years, and now I don't have to. And obviously that's down to people maybe not having deep roots in their faith. But what we're talking about here is the fact that habits can break, and trying to get people to come to church out of habit is not a good idea, because as soon as something like COVID comes along, as soon as something disruptive comes along in that person's life, they're just not going to bother turning up. And that's why it's so important to be about lifestyle, especially if you look at a lot of these clothing companies now. They've all moved away from what's known as like a influencer or follower style of marketing, where it's just having the followers or having a crowd of people come and join you is enough to sell products. They've all moved to lifestyle. And that's because people want to live the lifestyle that they see. And so if a church can get in the community and show that this lifestyle is enriching both the community and the people that attend, that is doing good things and seeing real life change and transformation, people are going to naturally want to be attracted to that and come along. And I think that is really what branding is about, is understanding, is someone who, like you said, either first impression or through word of mouth, is hearing about a church and they know, okay, this is something that is definitely transforming lives. This is something that is making a huge impact in the community. This is something that is bigger than anything I could ever do on my own. And it all comes down to those small details, right? I think it was a Barna study, or it was another kind of big church study a few years back that listed the top 5 reasons of why people no longer, or if they came to a church for the first time, why they wouldn't attend again. And one of them was just if the bathrooms are clean, right? And that's the same thing as you were saying, Stephen, is like, if it can be that minuscule and that small of a detail, where you go into the bathroom and it's not as clean as you would expect, that can turn someone away from church. Then of course the visual identity of a church can do the same. Of course, if the screens are distracting, or if the bulletins, overcomplicated and hard to understand, then those things are really like what can drive people away. And so this is what we're talking about when we talk about brand strategies, is not just the overarching theme, but then you focus that all down and narrow that all down and put it under the microscope and see all those small details, and you go, is this aligned to our new brand strategy? I guess there's two things churches can align to, and they should align to it together: their mission and the Bible, right? Like they both have very important parts of a church. Right. I would hope that a church is aligned biblically, but also at the same time, some churches want to do worship or have an impact on worship, or want to really dive into the heart of worship. Some churches are really more about community outreach, and that's all to do with mission. Yeah. And so a church is really healthy to go through the brand strategy and go, okay, actually, what is our mission? What are our mission values? What's our brand statement? And really understand that, because every time they have a decision to make, they can align it to two things. What does the Bible say? And what does our mission statement say? Right. And you go ahead. Go on, what were you going to say?
Well, so during our discovery process, we work on brand attributes, and those really help us understand the brand narrative. And so 3 of the 6 categories that we kind of develop attributes for is voice, feeling, and impact. So voice, feeling, and impact, when you think of those 3 words, that gives you a start to finish mindset of the narrative that your church is trying to accomplish. So voice being, that's the first time someone's heard about you. Feeling, that's the first time they've experienced you. And then the impact is, that's when their life has been transformed or changed. So when we look at the strategy behind each of these churches that we're working with, we think about, hey, how is the narrative? And really the last few handful of times we've noticed a pattern where those churches come back and they're like, man, we really loved the brand narrative, because it gives them an idea of what they want to aspire to. They want to have people hear them, or have them sound to people the way that they wish to sound. And it's not like, you're trying to sound like all this, like a cool hip church. No, it's just, you're trying to define your mission, like you said, trying to, make the message of Jesus beautiful as it is, and you're trying to make it attractive to people. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think that you need to be very strategic. You need to be grounded in your own principles and your own values as a church and as a people, and allow that to kind of be your guiding force. And that's really what we try to do. At the Church Media Squad, is like, we try to help them understand, everything that you're doing right now, it may not be bad. It could be better, right? So let's partner together, and let's try to figure out what a great strategy is moving forward. But I agree, churches, they can't dismiss branding, because whether they like it or not, they already have a brand, and they already have a reputation in the community, and maybe they just need an outside party or an outside person to come in and help them with that strategy.
Let's be honest, managing the resources of a church is no walk in the park. But what if you could have stunning designs without breaking the bank? Or a team to craft your newsletters and create and schedule all your social posts? Enter Church Media Squad. They're here to help you save time and look incredible, so you can pour more energy into your congregation and less into your laptop. And get this, they save each of their partner churches an average of 15 weeks of work every single year. That's a game changer. Ready to learn more? Head to churchmediasquad.com and discover how they can help your church today. It's interesting, as you were saying that, I was reminded that the church is the bride of Christ. And when you think about a bride on her wedding day, she has put so much effort into how she looks, right? Like the dress, the makeup, the flowers, everything has a intentional meaning, and everything is about revealing the beauty of that person. And that it's the same for the church. Like, the church is the bride, and the church is not, we're not calling it the church is the wife or the church is the girlfriend. The church is the bride. The church, this is her wedding day. Right. And every day when we approach the church, it should be as beautiful as the bride is. That's the standard, right? That's what we set. That's what we set as the standard, is that we aim for that. And that's not a new thing. That's something that, if you look over hundreds and thousands of years, the beauty has been prioritized in the church, from architecture to stained glass to murals and paintings. Yeah. Every form, even like my local cathedral has wood carvings in every pew. and everything's meticulously done. It's all about craftsmanship, and that's all to do with reflecting beauty. So when we talk about bulletins and LED screens, and when we talk about those things that may seem superficial, actually it's all to do with, okay, this is a modern take on what beauty is, and how do we define that based on the church's mission and values.
There was a time where I was trying to pursue my master's, and I was taking some courses at Liberty University, and one of them was art history, and it's incredible. Like, I would encourage any pastor to read up on the history of art, because sometimes, at least sometimes in the environment that I grew up in, like, people kind of dismiss, like, oh, you're not going to make a career out of that. Like, you're not going to, what's that? That's not important. When you look at church history, man, art is everywhere. And like, I love how you said cathedrals, because, man, when you look at Europe and, that area where, everything kind of came to a height when Christianity was at its height, regardless of what you think of different denominations, okay? When you look at how they presented the message of Christ, how they presented the person of Christ and the church itself, like, it's gorgeous. I mean, a lot of the painters and sculptors, as sinful as they were sometimes, they all went back to, hey, there's a creator, there's a person that I need to be responsible to, and they had this conflict inside them. And I feel like that's, the Bible says to go out in the highways and hedges and compel them to come. Well, in our day and age, how do we compel them? We compel them with the tools that God has put in our life, tools like technology. We shouldn't shy away from design. We shouldn't shy away from these things, because that's how people learn. That's how people are gravitated towards something. And so I love the word compel, because you're trying to convince them. And one of the things that I think a lot of churches, even the church that, we grew up in, is they shied away from the term marketing. And I understand why. Obviously, it's a secular word, like you're trying to market somebody. But when you look up at the word outreach, it literally has the same meaning, right? And so really, when churches are talking about outreach, you're literally talking about marketing. Yeah. You're trying to convince somebody that what you have to say or what you have to do is vitally important to their life. And I think, if churches get back to some of the fundamentals and get back to the importance of media and art and how it's not taking the place of your doctrine or your church and all that, it's helping it. It's going to enhance it. And I think, I agree with the bride of Christ. Like, that's a great analogy, obviously. And I think churches just need to be more strategic in the why. Why are they doing this? Why do they need that? Why do they say it like that? Why do they do their services? Be willing to change and be a little bit more fluid in some of those decisions, and then understand how your brand is going to affect your community in a powerful way.
Yeah, I think quite often we don't give enough credit to, one, just how powerful the gospel is, but also how beautiful the gospel is. And that idea that, for thousands of years, people have been awestruck about this story, about how there's a grace for someone who could do so much wrong in the world, or someone who has sinned can find salvation. Marketing is just a way of presenting that story, but it's not the marketing that does the work, right? Like,
right.
When we're in the secular world, the marketing is that we're pushing to get someone to buy a product or to invest something for their personal gain. Now, Christianity and receiving salvation is a personal gain of some sort, but it's also a much bigger thing than that, of understanding we are part of the body of Christ, and we have received salvation, and there's a place where we're going to be spending eternity. And what happens is, when we get that vision, obviously we want to share that with other people. And it's not about our own personal gain. It's about seeing other people saved and experiencing that grace and forgiveness. And so a lot of the time, the gospel does 90% of the work, probably does 99% of the work. All we have to do is make sure that we have got it in front of the person, right, in a way that compels them, like you said. And most of the time, the best thing about what we do is that the truth does the work for us. And we just have to make sure it gets into the hands of the right people. And so that in terms of branding, in terms of how we present that, all we're doing is we're just removing unnecessary noise, and we're removing those things and just making sure that what we represent as a church, what we represent as the body of Christ, and what the church represents as the bride of Christ is the most pure form as possible. Right. And it has the most important parts represented, and it's clear. And I think clarity is one of those things that really actually helps to compel people, because they go, oh, this is what it's about. This was for 40 years I was confused about what the church did. I heard all these stories about the church, and then you come along with this clear piece of clarity. They understand what it means to be part of a church. They understand what it means to receive salvation, and that's it. Then they're on their journey of transformation. And so I think branding is hugely, hugely important. We've got a few more minutes here,
Sure.
but I wanted to kind of, we've got a list of questions, but I think there's one that's really important here is, what are some of the common mistakes that churches make when it comes to branding, and how can we avoid them as church people?
Yeah. Man, where do we start? So branding mistakes. I think one of the biggest ones would be inconsistent messaging and design, right? So there's an inconsistency. We've already talked about consistency, and that's the biggest part. Is branding should be a consistent push of what you do, why you do it, how you do it. And I think there's a lot of common mistakes. One of the most common mistakes is that inconsistency and across all of their platforms. And I think nowadays churches are trying to be everywhere all at once. All right. They have every social media account possible and known to man, like they have an account with it and they have it up on their website. Like, I think that's a mistake. I think trying to focus on what you do best, where you do it best is very important. Having people on your team that know your message and know your mission. They're not just, posting things or putting things out into the bulletin or to the slides that don't match your message and your voice. For instance, there's a church that we're working with now, and they're great people, and they would even agree with me on this. They had 6 different logos just spread out everywhere. And I asked them, I said, do you guys have a current logo? And they said, not really. We have 6. And I'm like, great. Where do we start? And that's confusing for people in the community, because if everything looks different, everything sounds different, how are they supposed to know what to do with their life? If they say, well, this church is inconsistent, how are they going to teach me about being a consistent father, mother, husband, wife? And I think the other thing is just ignoring the audience. You're ignoring the community. Some churches make the big mistake of designing their brand solely on the preferences of the leadership. And I think that's very bad, because leadership can change, preferences can change. And so when you're designing it based off of that person's preference, well, what if in 5 years that preference changes? Well, then now you're stuck with a design or a look that is not consistent with your values. And I think also over complicating design. It doesn't have to be complicated. Your brand does not have to be complicated. Simplify things. Look at all of your values and say, what is one value? If I had one 30-second conversation with somebody, what would I want them to know about my church? And usually that is what we build the foundation on, is understanding, okay, if they had 30, 45 seconds with somebody, what do you want to tell that person? And we use that from the ground up, going all the way up to your visual identity, because I believe matching your values with your visuals, I think, is vitally important. But I think if you were to take away one word from this whole conversation, I think it really is consistency. That's what branding is. It's being consistently in front of people, consistently sounding the same, looking the same, adjusting it as you see fit. Over the years, there's always some adjustments. COVID was an adjustment. Obviously, you want to make some adjustments, but you don't need to go switch your logo every 5 years or every 3 years or every year. You don't have to do that. Spend the investment in both your time and your resources. It doesn't have to be our company at Church Media Squad. It could be a freelancer who does it really well. Or it could be a volunteer on your church staff. It doesn't matter. But invest the time and energy into something like your brand and understand why it's important as a church.
Yeah, I think how a church is represented is both branding from the outside. I think the logo and how the church looks is more for the newcomer, right? The person that is building a first impression of the church. It is also a kind of a standard for the church congregation to fly, or to be represented by. But I think a lot of the actual branding comes down to discipleship within the church. How are you imparting your visions and values into the church as a leader? And then how is the church outworking that in their community? That's what's going to build the reputation of the church, is how people go about their daily lives. But then you've got that standard, you've got that mark, you've got that visual that says this is what is the representation of the people of this church. And those two things are symbiotic, and they're both about consistency. You have to have consistent discipleship and consistent branding. And those two things, when they work together, will represent a very good church, and people will see that church in the community and they won't have a problem with it. There's so many churches that are coming against a lot of friction, and I think it's because sometimes one of those two things is out of balance. That's not to say that all churches that receive friction are doing something wrong, because we know that the world is kind of against us in some regards. But in terms of in terms of identifying that, maybe there's something you can look at, saying, hey, is our branding and how we represent ourselves to newcomers, is that strong, and is our discipleship strong? And those two things put together, I think, can actually have a really powerful impact on the church. So, Stephen, thank you so much for sharing all this information. I think as part of season 2, what we're doing is we're asking for some hot takes, because I think there's always room for a bit of controversy in these podcasts. So, Stephen, hit us with your hot take of church branding.
Churches that shy away from branding because they see it as too corporate are completely missing the conversation and the mark of branding and what it is. So here's the truth. Branding isn't just about flashy logos. It's not about your catchy slogans. It's about consistent communication. It's about clearly, effectively telling the world who you are, what you stand for, and why you matter as a church. In our current culture, we're bombarded with messages and companies every single second. And if your church's brand can't cut through all of the noise and resonate with people, no matter how powerful your message is, which is the message of Jesus Christ, you really get lost in the shuffle. So branding is not a superficial exercise. It's a vital tool for your ministry. You put it in your toolbox, you use it effectively and efficiently. It's about ensuring that your message is impactful, just as your mission is. And so when you're doing it strategically, branding doesn't detract from your spiritual goals, it amplifies them. And, that's why I think branding is so vitally important for churches and for you to understand.
There we go. I would consider that a hot take, but after listening to this conversation, I feel like everyone would now agree, because you've unpacked it so well and explained to us exactly why branding is important. And I've learned a lot today as well. It's helped me to have some ideas and some things click, and maybe that will help inform my work in the future. So, Stephen, thank you so much.
There's a lot of information out there. And I know you just had Austin Plescott on last season, and he's a great example of doing branding well at a church. And so, learn from people, learn to read and navigate things, and even going outside the church and, listening to voices of people that do branding well and then adapt it to the church world, I think is important as well.
Yeah, and that's what I'm so excited for about season 2 as we kind of go through this, is that for me personally, I'm learning so much more about the wider scope of church. So not just the creative stuff, which I've been in and around for a while, but also like more than that. So we look at worship and outreach and vision and giving and all of those things that I'm not as experienced in. I'm going to be learning along with you guys as well. So Stephen, for anyone who wants to know more about branding, maybe wants to know more about what they can achieve with the squad, what's the best way for them to contact you, and how can they follow what you're doing?
Yeah, so I don't have social media. I have just a LinkedIn page, so they can search my name through that. But I just point everybody to churchmediasquad.com. It's a very resourceful website. You can go through and see all the products that the squad is offering. We're helping hundreds and hundreds of churches around the globe, mainly in the Northern American area. But, we're excited. We have a great team of people, designers, creatives, video editors, brand strategists, all of that, web designers. And we love the church and we love helping the church. And Church Media Squad does it the best.
There you go. Said it yourself. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us. And we'll see you guys on the next episode of Church Circle Podcast Season 2.